AOC just hit Vice President JD Vance with a $100 million lawsuit. And the evidence she dropped? It's not just damaging, it's career-ending. This isn't political theater. This is a full-blown takedown. Rain hammered the steps of the U.S. District Courthouse in Washington, D.C., as reporters clutched their mics and phones beneath dripping umbrellas. No one expected Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to speak. Most thought it would be just a filing and a statement emailed to press. But there she was, walking out of the glass doors with firm steps, flanked by her legal team, and right behind her, Jasmine Reyes. AOC paused at the podium, papers in hand, soaked but composed. She looked straight ahead and said it plainly. "We're filing a $100 million defamation suit against Vice President JD Vance for orchestrating a calculated campaign to destroy the reputation of Jasmine Reyes," she said. "This isn't political, it's personal, and it's about justice." The crowd of reporters burst into overlapping questions. Jasmine didn't speak, she didn't need to. Her presence said enough. She stood quiet but strong, her eyes scanning the sea of cameras. People were already texting, tweeting, recording. Some weren't even sure who Jasmine was. Others did, and they remembered. The young aide with sharp policy instincts, the one who once went toe-to-toe with a senior lobbyist in a closed-door energy roundtable and came out ahead. But none of that mattered now. In the public eye, she was the girl who'd been called a fraud, a leaker, a liar. Her reputation had been stripped down in headlines and memes, and now she was the centerpiece of one of the most high-profile lawsuits D.C. had seen in years. Inside the courthouse, the actual filing told a longer, darker story. AOC's lawyers had pages of evidence, dates, emails, metadata. It laid out how Vance's team allegedly cut and twisted Jasmine's words from a government recording, then leaked those manipulated clips to online outlets. The clips went viral within 48 hours. So did the hashtags. Hashtag fake whistleblower, hashtag Reyes leaks, hashtag fire her now. Within a week, Jasmine was off the congressional calendar. Her badge was deactivated, her inbox wiped. It happened so fast that even allies didn't know what to believe. Now, the lawsuit laid it all bare. Jasmine had blown the whistle during a classified subcommittee meeting on Vance himself. She had recorded audio showing him pushing back against the release of a bipartisan report on industrial chemical dumping in parts of central Ohio, the same region where one of Vance's largest donors operated. When Jasmine flagged the conversation, quietly, through the proper internal channels, the retaliation began. It didn't come in the form of a threat. It came in edits, in camera cuts, in anonymous leaks to bloggers and pundits who'd chew the story until it had no resemblance to the truth. The press conference lasted just over 4 minutes. Then AOC stepped back and walked away. No questions, no clarifications, just enough to send every major outlet scrambling to report it first. Inside the courthouse, Jasmine's legal counsel submitted the thumb drive that held the full recording. One of the court clerks whispered that it was devastating, but it wouldn't be released publicly. Not yet. That didn't stop people from speculating. Social media split down party lines. Some people called it a stunt. Others saw it as a breaking point, someone finally holding power accountable, even if that power was sitting in the West Wing. Cable news lit up within hours. CNN, MSNBC, Fox, every channel debated Jasmine's credibility, AOC's motives, and Vance's silence. He hadn't issued a single comment since the memo leaked 2 days earlier. The White House stayed quiet too, but people noticed what wasn't said. No denial, no defense, just silence. Outside the courthouse, as Jasmine slipped into a black SUV with tinted windows, someone from the crowd called out, "We believe you!" She turned, just for a second, but it was enough to see the tears in her eyes. But what really pushed Jasmine to blow the whistle in the first place? And what exactly did she hear in that classified meeting? Before the headlines, before the lawsuit, Before the cameras followed her like a shadow, Jasmine Reyes was just the smart, no-nonsense policy staffer who preferred email over small talk. Born and raised in Yuba City, California, Jasmine was the youngest of three. Her dad worked nights as a warehouse foreman. Her mom cleaned homes for families who barely noticed she was there. Jasmine knew early on what it felt like to be invisible. Not overlooked, ignored. By the time she turned 16, she'd taught herself how to code, led a walkout at her high school over contaminated water fountains, and started a free tutoring group at the local library. She didn't wait for permission. She moved quietly, efficiently, with purpose. She graduated from Cal State Sacramento, debt-heavy but proud, and landed a fellowship in D.C. 2 years later, she was working policy under Representative Annika Lowell from Oregon. That's where she first crossed paths with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It wasn't some grand moment, no spotlight, no handshake photo, just a committee session on environmental regulations where Jasmine handed off a briefing that caught AOC's attention. It was short, sharp, and packed with citations no one else had bothered to include. AOC called her into her office the next day. "You write like someone who actually gives a damn," she said, tossing the file onto her desk. "Come work for me." Jasmine transferred to AOC's team in 2021. She didn't wear it like a badge. She didn't do social media photos or press shout-outs. She stuck to the work, and she was good at it. That's what made her stand out in rooms where most people were trying to be noticed. Jasmine wanted to understand the systems most folks barely questioned. She focused on environmental policy, energy lobbying loopholes, and agency regulation gaps. Boring to most, dangerous to some, especially to the wrong people. When she joined the Energy and Environment Subcommittee as a legislative liaison, she was one of the youngest people in the room. But she spoke with facts. Her style wasn't flashy. She didn't raise her voice. She just left people without an argument to stand on. And slowly, people started to pay attention. It was in early March when Jasmine was called to sit in on a classified session regarding a federal report linked to industrial runoff in central Ohio. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal, just a review of preliminary findings. But something didn't sit right. Vance was there. So were two lobbyists who weren't supposed to be. Jasmine said nothing. She took notes, listened, and when the meeting ended, she walked straight back to her desk and listened to the recording she'd made using the memo function on her secure phone. She hadn't broken protocol. The phone was issued to aides for classified note-taking, but she listened again, then a third time. That night, she didn't sleep. In the recording, JD Vance could be heard dismissing the significance of the contamination data, urging committee members to delay release until we've had a chance to realign messaging. He named a company, Halston Materials. Jasmine knew that name. It had been flagged twice in EPA reviews and was one of Vance's campaign's largest contributors. The next day, she filed a Level 1 internal disclosure with the Office of Congressional Ethics. It wasn't dramatic, just a one-paragraph summary and an official alert. But something must have tipped someone off. Within 72 hours, a blurry screenshot of Jasmine at the committee meeting was shared by a fringe political blog with the caption, "Whistleblower or opportunist?" Hours after that, an edited clip of Jasmine questioning the data integrity of the report made its way to a right-wing podcast. Heavily cropped, completely out of context. People she didn't know were calling her incompetent, a plant, mentally unstable. She was accused of fabricating her resume, misusing funds, even leaking sensitive info to foreign press. None of it was true, but it spread, and Jasmine could feel her world getting smaller. One night, 2 weeks later, AOC walked into her office. It was late. Most staff had already left. "I want to hear the original," she said, pulling out a chair. "From the top." Jasmine opened the voice memo file on her phone and hit play. For the next 12 minutes, neither of them said a word. When it ended, AOC just sat there. Then, "You sure you want to go forward?" Jasmine nodded once. "I don't see another option." But when Jasmine submitted her evidence to the ethics office, things didn't go the way she expected, and that's when the real smear campaign began. The room didn't have windows. Most classified committee hearings were held in places like that. Sterile, soundproof, cold. Jasmine sat along the back wall, surrounded by mid-level aides, a few policy analysts, and staff attorneys. The congresspeople sat up front. Vice President JD Vance entered last after everyone else had taken their seats. He wasn't technically supposed to be there. Vice presidents don't usually insert themselves into subcommittee work, but there he was. Coat off, sleeves rolled up, holding a binder so thick it looked like it had been printed straight from a government server. No one asked questions about his presence. Not in the moment. The meeting began with a review of a report drafted jointly by the EPA and the U.S. Geological Survey. It detailed unusually high levels of industrial pollutants, benzene, chromium-6, and PFAS compounds, found in the groundwater near the Little Miami River in Ohio. Cancer clusters had been reported in nearby counties. Birth defects, too. The report didn't name companies, but anyone who'd been around knew who the primary polluter was. Halston Materials, a billion-dollar conglomerate headquartered in Mason, Ohio. Heavy donor, major lobbyist presence, deep ties to JD Vance's inner circle. Jasmine sat, hands in her lap, phone on the table, recording everything through the approved secure memo app. She knew what she was doing wasn't illegal. In fact, it was common practice for aides to review classified sessions later for accuracy. Still, she felt something tighten in her chest when Vance started speaking. "I understand the need for transparency," he said, tapping his finger against the binder. "But if this report gets released without context, it's going to be weaponized. We need to think strategically." Rapal Lowell interrupted. "Strategically? These are health reports. We're talking about kids getting sick." Vance smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "What I mean is, we should delay publication until we can coordinate with local agencies on messaging. We don't want panic, we want clarity." Another congressman, someone from Kansas, asked what coordination actually meant. Vance answered quickly. "Let's say we give Halston time to prepare a remediation plan, show they're being proactive. That way, when the numbers drop, the public sees resolution, not blame." Jasmine's pen stopped moving, her jaw tightened. That was the moment. Right there. It wasn't about health, it was about optics. And the fact that no one pushed back after that made her feel like she'd missed a memo everyone else had read. The conversation continued for another 45 minutes. Vance dominated it, steering the focus away from enforcement and toward narrative management. He never said cover up, but that's what Jasmine heard between the lines. When the meeting ended, she walked back to her office in silence. She didn't take the elevator. She needed the stairs. She needed time to think. Back at her desk, she listened to the audio. Twice. Then she opened a blank memo in the internal disclosure system and began typing. The next day, she sent the report to the Office of Congressional Ethics. She didn't include the audio file, just the summary of the meeting, noting the specific language Vance used and the timeline he proposed for delay. She wanted to protect herself while still raising the flag. 3 days passed. Then something strange happened. Jasmine received a calendar invite for a meeting that didn't exist. When she clicked on the location, it was blank. She checked with her scheduler. No one had booked it. Hours later, her badge stopped working at one of the secure entry points. Probably a system error, security told her. But she knew better. That night, she called her brother back home. She didn't go into detail, just said she might be taking a step back from work soon. His voice cracked a little when he said, "You okay?" "I think I will be," she replied, "eventually." But she wasn't ready for what happened next. A video surfaced on a political blog known for smear jobs. It showed Jasmine at the hearing, only it was cut down to 47 seconds. In it, she's heard saying, "It might be worth coordinating the release just to avoid public panic." She'd said that, but in a different context. Right after Rep. Lowell asked how to manage community meetings post-report, her answer had been part of a broader suggestion on transparency strategies, but cut the first and last 30 seconds, and it looked like she was on Vance's side. The comments flooded in fast. Twitter threads, fake accounts, doctored screenshots of her LinkedIn, accusations of being on Halston's payroll. Even a photo of her drinking wine with coworkers got spun into partying while people suffer. Jasmine sat in her apartment in D.C., phone face down, TV off, staring at the wall. She hadn't even told her parents yet. She didn't want them to worry. But deep down, she felt something twisting, like she was falling through a hole no one else could see. But as Jasmine tried to stay afloat, more edited clips started appearing online, faster, crueler, and clearly coordinated. By the end of the week, Jasmine couldn't walk down the hall without someone glancing up from their phone. Not out of curiosity, out of suspicion. Her inbox was locked. Her Capitol Hill badge still worked, but only for general access. She wasn't looped into briefings anymore. Meetings she was supposed to attend were postponed. No one said anything to her face, but the silence said enough. She sat through it all, quietly documenting everything. Who stopped replying, what meetings she was cut from, which files were suddenly restricted. She knew how these games were played. Once the smear started, people pulled back, not because they believed it, but because they didn't want the dirt touching them too. The worst part wasn't the whispering, it was the isolation. She texted AOC twice that week. No reply, not because the Congresswoman didn't care, but because even her support could make things worse if timed wrong. That's how precise this attack was. Strategic, deliberate, patient. Then came the second clip. Another post on the same political blog, this time with a banner headline, Reyes flip-flops on contamination report. The video opened with Jasmine saying, "There's no solid proof of direct harm." What the clip didn't include was the next sentence. Until the water sampling reaches conclusive levels, which we expect within 2 weeks. The comments were brutal, personal, racial, sexist. She stopped reading them after the first hour. The narrative had been set. Jasmine was a fraud, a puppet, a fake activist who tried to bring down a vice president and got caught. And then, as if coordinated with the release of the second clip, Jasmine received an anonymous email at her personal account. The subject line was just one word: think. Inside was a screenshot of her application to the Congressional Ethics Office. The actual file, red-stamped received. No one else should have had access to that. She printed the email and brought it to AOC's Chief of Staff, Julian Harrow, who looked at it for less than 5 seconds before muttering, "They've been inside this for weeks." Jasmine's voice barely came out. "How?" Julian rubbed his face. "Because they're not worried about playing fair. They don't have to be." That same day, Jasmine got a call from a number she didn't recognize. She let it go to voicemail. It was a reporter, someone from St. Louis Ledger, a mid-tier outlet. The voice was calm, rehearsed. "Hi, Jasmine. This is Kendra Lewis with the Ledger. We're hearing reports that you fabricated portions of your policy resume. Would love to give you a chance to comment before we publish. You can call me back at..." She didn't even finish listening. By then, she'd stopped leaving her apartment after dark. She kept her blinds shut. The only time she felt safe was when her neighbor's dog barked through the hallway, an old German shepherd with a limp and a loyalty to anyone who smelled like breakfast sausage. But something in her started to shift that night. Something small, like a click. She knew she wasn't safe, but she also knew she hadn't lied. And she still had the original recording. That was leverage. That was truth. That was hers. The next morning, Jasmine pulled the memory logs from her phone and backed them up onto 2 flash drives. She stored one in a box under her bathroom sink, taped inside a half-empty box of tampons. The other she mailed to her cousin in Fresno. A week passed, then 2. The news cycle moved on. JD Vance gave a brief press comment outside the Naval Observatory, saying he wouldn't be distracted by malicious distractions. His approval ratings stayed stable. Jasmine's name faded from trending lists. The silence around her deepened, but it didn't feel like peace. It felt like the breath right before something else hit. And it did. AOC called. It was late. Jasmine was in bed, a sweatshirt over her head, trying to will herself to sleep. "I need to see you," AOC said. "Now." An hour later, Jasmine was in a secure conference room with AOC and Julian. No staffers, no phones. AOC handed her a printed document. It was the original internal memo, but someone had annotated it. In red ink, there were timestamps, quote marks, initials, JV marked next to multiple lines. Jasmine stared at it. Where did this come from? "A staffer from Oversight," AOC said. "They're anonymous, for now." Julian looked across the table. "You're not crazy. You're not alone. They really did try to destroy you." But Jasmine's fight was far from over, because what came next would push everything into the public eye. Jasmine didn't cry when she saw the annotations. She stared at them, heart pounding, barely blinking. The initials were there in plain red ink. JV circled twice beside notes about delaying the report, once next to a line that read, "Coordinate with Halston PR, pre-damage control." It was real, and worse, calculated. Julian slid the memo back into a folder, snapped the metal clasp shut, and leaned forward. "There's more." He turned a laptop toward Jasmine and hit play. The screen lit up with footage from a staff-only hallway near the committee room. A grainy security feed showed a man, thick build, suit, close-cropped hair, standing near the document drop-off slot. In his hand, the same type of folder Jasmine had used when submitting her internal report. He waited until no one passed, slipped it in, then looked straight up at the camera before walking away. It was Alan Redmond, one of Vance's longtime aides. Quiet, loyal, no official public profile, but known in staffer circles as the guy who could get things done, especially when they weren't supposed to be done. "Same guy who called security when your badge failed," Julian added. "It's all tied together." Jasmine didn't say anything for a long time. Then, "So they intercepted it." AOC nodded. "We think they flagged your memo before it reached internal review. That's how they got ahead of it. That's how they flipped the narrative so fast." Jasmine leaned back in her chair, exhaustion written into every line of her face. It was never just online trolls. This had been engineered from the start. And the digital attacks? Those weren't just coincidences either. A week earlier, someone had leaked a doctored version of her resume to a blog known for political takedowns. It claimed Jasmine had lied about a graduate certificate in environmental policy. In reality, she'd completed it, remotely, through UC Davis. But the copy that made the rounds removed her transcript and changed the program dates. Dozens of blue-check commentators jumped on it. She lied about her degree. More proof the left manufactures experts. She's a fraud, just like the people she works for. The post got over 600,000 views. Jasmine's inbox filled with threats. Her apartment door got egged. Even her cousin in Fresno, who'd received the backup drive, called her in a panic after a strange car sat outside her house for 2 nights in a row. And behind all of it, JD Vance's team hadn't issued a single public statement, not even a denial, just silence, while the online world twisted Jasmine into a villain. But internally, they were very much active. A former aide from the communications office, who left 3 months prior, reached out to AOC staff anonymously. He'd seen a message chain from Redmond to Vance timestamped 2 days after Jasmine's hearing. It read, "We have enough to sink her credibility. Distribute segments in waves. Start with the coordination line. We'll prep partners for rollout." Partners didn't mean allies. It meant influencers. Online personalities who posted constant outrage content, often with fake headlines or misleading edits. They didn't care if it was true. They cared if it clicked. Jasmine was a perfect target. Young, sharp, brown skin, female, unapologetically progressive. To the right audience, that was enough to discredit her, even without facts. But the facts were coming back. Julian and AOC had assembled the uncut audio, the chain of custody logs, and now the memo. They had legal experts reviewing the whistleblower protections violated. And they had one more thing, a second anonymous staffer ready to testify that Vance personally authorized Redmond to leak the edited clips. That changed everything, because once that name, Redmond, hit the press, the pattern became undeniable. On a Monday morning, a news anchor at WRN-TV in Columbus broke the story live. We've confirmed that a senior staff member in the Vice President's office was involved in distributing selectively edited government recordings to political media outlets in what sources describe as a targeted reputational takedown of a federal employee. Within hours, it was everywhere. Cable networks called it sabotage. Editorials asked whether Vance had violated his oath. Talk shows debated whether Jasmine should sue. Protesters started gathering outside the Capitol, holding signs that read, "Justice for Reyes" and "Truth has a timestamp." But Vance still didn't speak. Not publicly, not on record, and not to Jasmine. His silence became its own scandal. Meanwhile, Jasmine kept quiet. No interviews, no tweets. She stayed in D.C., spending her days preparing legal documents with AOC's counsel. Every so often, she'd get messages from strangers, mostly women, some angry, some scared, some just thankful. One stood out. It said, "I saw what they tried to do to you. You didn't break. That gave me strength." Jasmine didn't reply, but she read it twice. But the momentum wouldn't stay quiet for long because someone was about. The hallway outside Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's office was packed. Staffers moved fast, phones buzzed in hands, doors opened and shut in sharp bursts. But inside her office, things were still. Jasmine sat across from her, a laptop open between them. On screen, the full unedited audio file from the classified hearing. Every second was time-stamped, every word documented. AOC leaned forward, her elbows on her knees. She wasn't furious, at least not on the surface. She looked surgical, focused. "You've got one thing they didn't expect," she said, eyes locked on the screen. "Receipts." Jasmine nodded, tight-lipped. "Everything they've cut is in here, the full context, the full timeline, every bit of it." Next to her sat Julian, still in his coat, scrolling through the voice memos, metadata logs. He'd verified them already through a digital forensics contact at Stanford. They were clean, untampered, certified. AOC stood and crossed to her desk, flipping open a file. "This is going to get louder before it gets better," she said. "You understand that, right?" "I do," Jasmine said. "I don't want to hide anymore." That's when AOC made the call. She didn't go through party leadership. She didn't wait for permission. She called her legal advisor, ordered a full review of the audio and memo files, and by the next morning had a civil suit draft in motion. The decision wasn't impulsive, it was strategic. Vance had let the narrative run wild, hoping it would burn itself out. He underestimated the power of truth documented in plain language, and he clearly hadn't counted on Jasmine sticking around. But Jasmine didn't want a public apology. She didn't want a headline win. She wanted accountability. AOC's team worked late, 2 full days in closed conference rooms. They laid out the structure of the defamation case: pattern of attack, malicious intent, falsified evidence, reputational harm, loss of employment access, and potential threats to personal safety. All anchored in a single fact: Jasmine's original recording hadn't been fabricated. It had been selectively edited and deliberately distributed in bad faith. But they needed more. That's when Jasmine remembered something. There was a moment right before the first leak hit when my login failed, but only on the internal server where I saved my early drafts. Julian looked up. "You're sure?" "Yes," she said. "I flagged it with IT, and they said it was a maintenance update." AOC nodded toward him. "Pull the request. Every system admin note. If anyone accessed her drafts before the leak, we have direct proof of tampering." 6 hours later, Julian returned with a printout. A metadata ping, user ID masked at Poquadinet, had accessed Marcella Jasmine's draft report 4 days before the first clip went public. The IP address? A proxy server linked to a contractor previously used by Redmond's team. They had their chain. With the timeline stitched tight, AOC requested a meeting with her ethics liaison and filed a sealed copy of the audio with the House Oversight Committee. Then she booked the courthouse steps. The next morning, before sunrise, she and Jasmine rode in silence through D.C. fog to the U.S. District Courthouse. No media yet, just preparation. "This will come for me too," AOC said, breaking the silence. "You know that, right?" Jasmine turned to her. "Why are you doing this?" AOC's voice didn't waver. "Because someone's got to, and because they thought you were disposable. That makes you dangerous." At 10:12 a.m., the filing was official. The number was large, $100 million, but symbolic. A signal to every aide, staffer, or assistant watching that what happened to Jasmine wasn't acceptable. That power didn't excuse cruelty, and that silence wasn't an option anymore. The press swarmed within minutes. Jasmine didn't speak, but her presence alone, the steadiness in her posture, the clear defiance in just showing up, was the loudest statement she could make. And JD Vance? Still no word, not from him, not from his team, but one of his senior comms advisors deleted their account that afternoon. Inside the courthouse, a USB was logged into evidence. It held the original audio along with the metadata trail and the memo with handwritten notes marked JV. Jasmine stepped outside, the noise of cameras and reporters rising like heat around her. But she didn't flinch. She looked past them, toward the line of interns watching from across the street. The young ones, the ones who still believed policy was worth fighting for. One girl raised her phone and whispered, "She's really doing it." But the fire wasn't out yet, because just days later, a leaked memo would expose something even more damning from Vance's own office. It started as a whisper. One reporter from the Arizona Daily Register, a publication that usually stuck to education and city council stories, tweeted out a blurry image of a government memo late on a Thursday night. At first, no one took it seriously. The tweet got maybe 50 likes in the first hour, but something about the document looked off. It wasn't the layout or the content, it was the name at the bottom. Alan Redmond, senior advisor to Vice President JD Vance. The same Redmond who'd been caught on security footage dropping an unmarked envelope into the congressional document slot 2 months earlier. This memo, stamped internal use only, wasn't supposed to exist outside Vance's staff channels. And yet, here it was, floating in the public square. Within minutes, national political reporters picked it up. By morning, the story had exploded. The memo wasn't long, just 3 pages. But it said enough. It outlined a coordinated communication strategy to counter reputational threats posed by whistleblower disclosures. Under bullet points, it named target subject Jasmine Reyes. It listed specific talking points, timing windows, and even suggested which media personalities to loop in for rapid narrative framing. One line jumped out the most. "We maintain plausible deniability by attributing leaks to independent media actors." There it was, in black and white, a playbook for the smear campaign. For most of Friday, reporters scrambled to confirm its authenticity. That didn't take long. A second source from within the Vice President's communications team verified the formatting and confirmed Redmond had emailed it to 6 recipients using a secure thread. The backlash was immediate. News segments played the memo line by line. Anchor desks pulled up side-by-side comparisons of the talking points and actual sound bites released over the past 2 months. The match was near perfect. Online outrage turned into something else. Momentum. The hashtags flipped. Reyes was right. Chesh, we heard the tape. Vance memo. Even people who hadn't followed the story began paying attention. You didn't need to understand congressional ethics to get the core idea. Someone in power had lied, and the lie was deliberate. Jasmine sat in AOC's office as the news rolled in. Her phone buzzed every few seconds. People she hadn't heard from in years were sending screenshots, forwarding articles telling her she'd won. But she didn't feel like she'd won anything, not yet. "This isn't over," she said quietly, staring at the memo displayed on a mounted screen across the room. AOC looked up from a legal brief. "No, but it's shifting." Julian came in with a stack of folders. "We've got 3 journalists asking for exclusive interviews, 2 Sunday shows reaching out, and someone from Vice's docu-unit wanting to follow Jasmine for a week." Jasmine shook her head. "Not now." AOC nodded in agreement. "Let the court handle the next move." But the court wasn't the only battlefield anymore. Outside, protesters had gathered on both sides of the courthouse. Some were holding signs calling Jasmine a fraud and deep state puppet. But most were there for her. College kids, former staffers, retired EPA scientists, moms with their kids. One sign stood tall above the crowd: "Truth shouldn't need permission." And then came the questions no one had asked yet. How much did Vance know, and when? Until now, the assumption was that his team had acted independently. But with his senior advisor's signature on the memo, that line was starting to blur. A former staffer, one who had resigned 2 months ago, agreed to speak to the press anonymously. He confirmed that Vance had not only seen the memo, but had personally approved its language before distribution. The VP wasn't in the dark, the staffer told Common Hill Weekly. He knew what Redmond was planning. He just didn't want fingerprints. The story broke that Saturday morning. Suddenly, this wasn't just a PR nightmare. It was a political crisis. Several lawmakers from both sides of the aisle began calling for an ethics investigation into Vance's conduct. House Oversight filed an inquiry. The White House, silent until now, issued a carefully worded statement about respecting the process and taking all allegations seriously. Inside AOC's office, Jasmine sat quietly, staring out the window. She hadn't spoken publicly yet, hadn't issued a statement. But the noise outside grew louder every hour. "People are starting to see what this really is," AOC said. "Not just a smear job, not just corruption, a blueprint, one that could be used on anyone." Jasmine didn't look away from the window. "I think that's what scares me most," she whispered. "That this isn't rare, it's normal, and we just happen to catch it." But in Washington, truth alone rarely wins. The court of public opinion was now wide open, and everyone wanted a piece. It didn't matter that Jasmine hadn't posted in weeks. Her name was everywhere. Talk shows debated her motives. Morning radio hosts mocked her voice. Cable news spun entire segments about the memo leak, but rarely showed the full context. The left praised her courage. The right called it a calculated stunt. In the middle? They weren't sure what to think yet, but they were watching. Everyone was. A week after the leaked memo dropped, Jasmine woke to find her face plastered across 3 major headlines. One calling her a hero, another suggesting she'd staged the scandal, and a third asking if she was a future political candidate. That one made her laugh out loud. She hadn't slept through the night in 2 months. Outside the Capitol, protesters had nearly tripled. The chants varied, some calling for accountability, others hurling insults at her, accusing her of sabotaging the administration from within. But the noise didn't matter as much as who started speaking next. Congressman Eli Brenner from Minnesota broke ranks and made a public statement calling for a full ethics investigation into Vance's role. He wasn't part of AOC's camp. If anything, the two had clashed before. But now the facts were too loud to ignore. "I may not agree with the Congresswoman on much," Brenner said in a CNN interview, "but I agree that no vice president should be using their office to silence a federal employee." By that evening, 3 more House members issued similar statements. Then Senator Claudine Ramirez, who hadn't been on camera in months, posted a single message to X: "If the truth threatens your power, maybe you shouldn't have power." Inside AOC's war room, Jasmine sat across from Julian and AOC, watching the clips roll in. The tide wasn't just turning, it was shifting. "She's the key now," Julian said. "Public perception. If she speaks, she could control the story." AOC looked at Jasmine. "But it's your call." Jasmine took a breath. "I'll speak, but only once. I want it clean. Nothing performative, no branding, just facts." The next morning, she sat down with Nina Callow, a respected journalist from the Seattle Ledger. No cameras, just an audio interview, one-on-one. Jasmine recounted everything, what she heard in the hearing, how her report was intercepted, the first leak, the fear, the silence. Callow asked, "Why didn't you just walk away when things got dangerous?" Jasmine answered simply, "Because I knew they'd do it again to someone else." The interview dropped that evening. No drama, no editing tricks, just a quiet, steady voice explaining how power had tried to erase her and failed. It caught fire. People shared it everywhere. Parents emailed it to their kids. Professors played it in classes. Even other whistleblowers from different industries reached out privately to say, "Thank you. You said what we couldn't." In response, Vance's team finally broke their silence. They released a bland 3-paragraph statement insisting the vice president had no knowledge of any unauthorized communication strategies and respects the integrity of all federal employees. No denial, no specifics, just a vague brush-off that raised more questions than it answered. But Jasmine wasn't focused on them anymore. She'd become something else. Not a symbol, not a martyr, just a reminder that truth can survive the machine if someone's stubborn enough to carry it. Still, not everyone was celebrating. Protesters outside her apartment hadn't disappeared. Online abuse continued. Someone spray-painted the words "stooge" across her front door in red. But this time, something was different. She opened her door, saw the word, and didn't feel scared. She felt angry, resolved. She called a local locksmith and had a security camera installed. Then she made tea, sat at her kitchen table, and pulled out her notes for court prep. Because now, with all eyes on her, she had to be sharper than ever. Inside the federal court, motions were being filed. The defense team asked for a dismissal. AOC's legal team pushed back hard, submitting forensic evidence, timestamp logs, and statements from 2 anonymous Vance staffers ready to testify under protection. The judge ordered a preliminary hearing. Outside the courthouse, the crowd grew. Jasmine walked through it that morning in a plain black coat, no makeup, hair tied back. She didn't wave, she didn't smile, she just kept walking. Inside, the courtroom was packed. When she took her seat at the plaintiff's table, people in the gallery leaned forward. One woman in the back, late 60s, silver hair and a bun, clutched a handwritten sign. "Truth deserves a mic." Jasmine caught it in the corner of her eye and finally let herself breathe. But what happened inside that courtroom next would expose more than just a smear campaign. It would test everything Jasmine had left. The courtroom didn't feel grand, no sweeping ceilings or polished wood. It felt narrow, functional, neutral, like it was designed to keep emotion out of everything. But that didn't work today. You could feel the tension before the judge even entered. Press huddled on benches normally reserved for observers. Legal analysts whispered predictions to one another under their breath. Jasmine sat beside her attorney, hands folded in her lap, her back straight. She didn't look around. She didn't need to. She could hear it in the quiet, the kind of silence where everyone's pretending not to look at you. Judge Rebecca Klein entered from the side door, expression unreadable. She adjusted her glasses, scanned the docket, then looked up. "We're here for the matter of Reyes Vance et al. Counsel. Are we ready to proceed?" They were. The defense team opened with what everyone expected, a motion to dismiss. They claimed there was no direct evidence that Vice President Vance had ordered the leak, that the memo in question had not been authenticated through official channels, and that any edited audio clips circulated online had not been sanctioned by the Office of the Vice President. They tried to make it sound clean, procedural. like Jasmine had overreacted to workplace gossip. But then Jasmine's lawyer stood, and everything changed. He didn't shout, he didn't grandstand. He simply pulled a USB drive from his coat pocket, walked to the screen at the front of the courtroom and said, "With the court's permission, we'd like to play a portion of Exhibit A, the original recording." Permission granted. The clip began. Vance's voice filled the room, not the chopped-up version, not the misleading quote, the real thing. "I'm not saying we hide the report. I'm saying we control the messaging before it becomes a problem." A pause, papers shuffling, then another voice. Congresswoman Lowell. "So we wait?" And then Vance again, clearer this time. "We don't wait, we realign. Get Halston's PR involved. By a few weeks, the public won't care about PFAS if we get ahead of it." Some people in the courtroom shifted in their seats. Others leaned forward. The tone, the phrasing, it didn't sound cautious. It sounded calculated. Jasmine didn't move. Her lawyer continued. "The defense claims the vice president had no knowledge of any communication strategies involving Ms. Reyes. Yet the memo entered into evidence, dated March 19th, includes not only her name but language directly tied to this conversation. We asked the court to consider this a coordinated effort, not isolated rumor." Then came the supporting materials. Login timestamps showing unauthorized access to Jasmine's draft memo. Records of phone calls between Alan Redmond and two known political influencers. Metadata logs from the leaked video clips. And sworn statements from two congressional staffers who had worked under Redmond and witnessed internal discussions about containing Reyes. One of those staffers, under protection, submitted the following line. "I heard Redmond say, 'We don't need to destroy her, just tilt the floor until she slips.'" The court murmured. The judge called for order. Then Jasmine took the stand. She adjusted the microphone once, then looked straight ahead. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. "I worked hard to be taken seriously in this town," she said. "Not to be famous, not to start fires, just to do the work. I followed protocol, I reported what I thought was dangerous. And within days, I was made to look like a liar." She paused. "They edited my words. They erased context. They flooded the internet with stories I didn't recognize. And they never once reached out to ask me if any of it was true." Across the aisle, Vance's legal team avoided eye contact. Jasmine continued. "I don't want attention. I want truth to matter again. And if we let this slide, we're telling every future whistleblower that silence is safer." The courtroom was still when she finished. Not quiet, still. The judge called a recess. Outside, the cameras waited. Inside, Jasmine sat alone on the bench just outside the chambers. A young court clerk passed by, stopped, turned back. "You didn't shake," she said softly. "I would have, but you didn't." Jasmine gave her a tired smile. "I've already done the shaking," she replied. But the fight wasn't over yet. The final ruling was still to come, and Jasmine's future rested on what the court and the public would decide next. The ruling didn't come quickly. 3 weeks passed, 3 long, restless weeks filled with headlines, interviews, debates, and speculation. Jasmine didn't speak during that time. She returned to a quieter version of her life. Morning walks with a baseball cap pulled low, coffee from the shop around the corner, texts left unread. The noise outside still buzzed, but inside she stayed still. Her attorney told her not to get her hopes up. "Judges take time," he'd said. Sometimes too much time. But the longer the silence stretched, the more people began to ask, what happens if she loses? It wasn't just about the money anymore. It wasn't even about Vance. It was about what it would mean to every person watching if someone like Jasmine, someone who followed the rules, told the truth and got chewed up anyway, walked away with nothing but scars. Then, on a Wednesday morning in early June, the court released its preliminary ruling. Jasmine was at home, sitting on her floor in sweats, laptop open. Her attorney called. "You won the motion to proceed. The judge denied dismissal. We're going to trial." Jasmine didn't speak. Not right away. She just sat there, her back against the wall, phone pressed to her ear, blinking fast. "Jasmine," her attorney said again, "you understand what this means, right?" She nodded, then realized he couldn't see her. "Yeah," she whispered, "I do." That same afternoon, AOC held a brief press event. This time, she kept it short. "The court has confirmed what we've known from the beginning. Jasmine Reyes was targeted, and now we're going to prove it." There were cheers, chichel, but also backlash. Vance's legal team filed a counterclaim, accusing AOC and Jasmine of defamation. They claimed reputational damage, political sabotage, and emotional distress. It didn't shake Jasmine. She'd already survived worse. Instead, she spent her days helping AOC's staff prepare for the trial. Quietly, from behind the scenes, the same way she used to work before any of this started. She reviewed memos. She helped sort evidence. She stayed off social media. Then came an unexpected call. Her father. He hadn't said much through the whole ordeal, only quiet support, asking how he could help. But this time, he asked a different question. "Are you proud of what you're doing?" Jasmine thought for a long time before answering. "I am now." He paused. "Your mom's been clipping your articles. She shows them to anyone who walks into the house." Jasmine smiled. For the first time in days, it reached her eyes. By now, her story had outgrown the courtroom. College students started quoting her testimony in public policy classes. A union leader in Pittsburgh referenced her in a speech about courage. Whistleblower support groups shared her interview as a training resource. Not because she was perfect, but because she kept standing. That's what stuck with people. The trial date was set for fall. Cameras would be allowed. Jasmine knew what that meant. Every look, every word, every pause would be analyzed, twisted, reposted. But she wasn't afraid anymore. AOC made it clear, win or lose, they'd keep fighting, not just for Jasmine, but for everyone who'd been told their truth didn't matter. At a private staff gathering a week before the trial prep began, AOC pulled Jasmine aside. No press, no speeches, just two people standing near a coffee table, plates in hand. "I meant what I said that first night," AOC told her. "You're dangerous to them, not because of what you leaked, but because you didn't break." Jasmine didn't reply right away. Then she said, "I think I did break, but I didn't stay broken." AOC nodded. "That's the difference." As the room buzzed with casual conversation, Jasmine stepped outside for air. She looked out at the Capitol dome, glowing against the sky. For a moment, she let herself imagine what it would feel like to testify again, this time with everything on record, every lie exposed, every voice heard, not just hers, but all of them. This wasn't about headlines anymore. It was about reminding the country that power doesn't work without people who are willing to question it. And as she turned to walk back inside, she knew something for sure. Even if they tried to erase her again, someone else would stand up next time. Because now they knew it was possible. If you believe truth still matters, share this story. And if you're ready to keep holding power accountable, subscribe. We're just getting started.